Hey everyone, Ken here, welcome back to another video, and in today's video of Roblox Studios 1, we're talking about the difference between the client and the server. And I kind of have these two objects just set out here to help explain the difference briefly. The client is the player's device, essentially, and the server is the static server that's somewhere in the world that your game's actually hosted on. So you can think about the client, it could be their phone, their tablet, their console, whatever it is they're playing on, and the server is what receives that and tells them what to render and everything like that. Just tells them what the game really is. And so if the client, for example, were to press W, the client isn't actually moving the player. The client is sending a message to the server that says, hey, I need the player to move, and then the server checks if the player can move, and if the player can move, then the server says, okay, then you move, and tells all the connected clients to render that that player moves forward a little bit. And that's a very basic explanation of how basically any kind of client-server communication works in any game, really. The client tells the server, asks the server things, and the server tells the client things. And I say asks and tells, and that's a key distinction because you can never truly trust the client. And we'll talk a lot more about that later. However, just know that your client should never handle any kind of like core game data, especially like player data, money, any kind of weird stat or anything like that, because the client is not the authority, the server is. Because if the client had a player just walking forward forever and the server never knew about it, the player would fall off the map, but the server would never knew that they fell off the map and never kill them, so they'd just be falling forever. That's a very light example of why the client's not the authority. But when you make the client authority, you start giving room to different exploiters and hackers and things like that in your game. And so ultimately, the client is where local scripts run, and the client can, through a variety of different methods, insert local scripts into the game in its instance of the game, if you will. Because the server tells the client like what to replicate. It's called client replication. And so the client replicates what the server says is there in the game, but if the client comes up with something and the client says, hey, this is in the game now, the server doesn't know about it because it's entirely on the client. So no kind of anti-cheat is truly going to be able to prevent the client from inserting such scripts into the game. However, what the server can do is every once in a while ask the client, hey, are you where you're supposed to be? How are you here? Like, why are you here? Can you normally be here? And if the answer to any of those questions doesn't match what they should be, then the server can appropriately handle whatever the client's behavior was, whether it be correcting it or taking it from the game or so on and so forth. And this is the basis of most anti-cheats. The server is, of course, the authority. Any server scripts run here. There's no UI objects ever on the server unless they're replicated to the client in the future, as UI can't render on the server. The server holds your game world and most of the behavior in your game as well. Anything that happens in a server script happens for everyone, and anything that happens in this local script runs for only that client that's running the local script. You can kind of think of it like two containers. The client holds local scripts and UI objects and whatnot. The server holds server scripts and basically the entire rest of your game. The client just gets told by the server what to render. And so you can kind of just understand this chain of authority, if you will. Then if the client is the keyboard that's like typing letters, asking the player to move or jump or whatever it's wanting the player to do, then the client has to ask the server if that can happen. The client can't just make it happen. It wants to, and it tries to, and plays the animation and everything like that. However, it has to ask the server, and the server, assuming it allows it, is what actually moves the player and makes them jump and so on and so forth. A very basic way to show this is in Roblox Studio, you have a humanoid object. That humanoid object is contained within any NPC or player. That humanoid object has a property called can jump. You don't have to worry about the humanoid object as a property. That's just the way the groundwork to say that can jump is a little checkbox. If that checkbox is on, it's checked, then the player can jump in your game. If it's off and unchecked, the player cannot jump in your game. And so the client, when you press spacebar, is asking the server, hey, is the can jump property of my player's humanoid object set to true? If yes, then the server allows the player to jump. If no, then the server doesn't, and the player just simply doesn't jump. And so you can kind of think of it like the client asks the server questions, and the server tells the client what to do. The client should never tell the server what to do, because that's a very dangerous thing to go into. And so server replication is kind of like when a player jumps, the client immediately wants to render. It tries to play the animation and everything like that, but the server has to first allow it, like I was talking about. Is that can jump property true or false? So, if it's true, then the server tells the client, okay, that player can jump. The client plays the animation, and the server tells all of the other clients connected to itself that that player jumped into render as such. That's server replication because the server is telling every client in the game what to render. This is how your game maps are loaded and everything like that as well. And if you trust the client with any kind of money or damage or teleporting your data, just anything at all that is relevant to your game and integral to it, then you shouldn't give the client control over that. You want to give the client the least to work off maliciously that they can, because if you give the client control over that player's money, then an exporter can set that value to 10,000 and get 10,000 money, whatever that represents in your game, for doing nothing. And that's, of course, not the intended behavior. But if the server assigns it, then even if the client changes it, the server will correct it, or it will just never truly take effect if you have the server manage all of the values. And when the player joins the game next time, what they hacked in won't even be there. The client can say, I have 1,000,000 gold, and the server essentially just doesn't care because the client can never tell the server what to do unless you allow it to do so specifically, which is where also verification comes in. Verification is something that we use in remote events. And we're getting into a lot of different things right now, but I have a little diagram here that I made. And this has the server, of course, as this black box, the client as this blue box, and the communication between them. And you can see the communication I have 3 little pipes for, if you will. So the server, this black pipe, will often tell the client what to do, what to render, what behavior to apply, and so on and so forth. This is the server replication we talked about a moment ago. The server tells the client, hey, this is what the game map looks like, now render it on the player's screen. The server will tell the client, hey, the player can or cannot jump, and so on and so forth for all of the server properties. The client can also sometimes tell something to the server. Now, the less authority that's in this blue pipeline where the client tells the server what to do, it's better. Because the client should never truly be able to tell the server anything besides what it thinks. So, think of it like the client has its opinion on what the player has, but the server actually knows it. So the client sometimes asks the server if its opinion is right. And if the client's opinion is wrong, then the server says, hey, that's not right, and the client needs to adjust it accordingly. There's also this orange wire here in the middle that the word communication is on, and this represents remote events and remote functions. They're things that allow the server and client to talk to each other directly back and forth. So remote events, remote functions, essentially are just ways that the client and server can talk back and forth to each other. And so if I have a local script on the client that triggers a remote event that tells the server that the player thinks they have 10,000 gold or whatever, then the server will check the actual amount of gold the player has, and if the player has 10,000 gold, it can return true to the client. And if the server thinks otherwise, it can return false to the client, and then how much gold the player actually has. And then the client can say, okay, so I'm right. Or, in the case of false on the actual amount of gold, okay, I'm wrong, the player should have this amount of gold and change it on the client so that the two match again. That's essentially how back and forth communication works. The client or the server will tell or ask something to the other, and the other can respond to confirm or deny that. And so, generally speaking, all of your visuals, your UI, and textures even, and things like that can be safely built on the client. However, the server is your final authority for anything that truly matters in your game. So things outside of main menus and different things like that, then the server should be the one to handle it. So again, the client asks questions and the server answers them. If it's ever reversed, that the server's asking questions and the client's answering them, then you've opened the door for exporters that they probably won't hesitate to take advantage of. So, again, I really want to stress it, the client asks questions to the server, not the other way around, for the integrity of your game. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's been beneficial to you, and if it has, make sure to leave a like and subscribe and comment down below what I should cover next.